Cannabis is fabulous. It cures and offers relief to humans every single day. It is a sacred plant. And you and I defend cannabis with unwavering dedication and heartfelt commitment. And yet, the truth of the matter is that cannabis can be abused. Cannabis can make some people sick. And those cultivating cannabis can get really sick by inhaling cannabis bioaerosols. We don't really want to admit it because so many people condemn cannabis falsely. I don't want to give them an inch. And yet, we really do need to look at this new research because we should push for better cannabis workplace regulations to keep our friends safe who spend their days growing our beloved cannabis. If you want to learn about cannabis health, cultivation, and technique efficiently and with good cheer, I encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter. We'll send you new podcast episodes as they come out, delivered right to your inbox, along with commentary on a couple of the most important news items from the week and videos too. Don't rely on social media to let you know when a new episode is published. Sign up for the updates to make sure you don't miss an episode. Also, we're giving away very cool prizes to folks who are signed up to receive the newsletter. This month's giveaway sponsor is Fish Poop brand Fish Poop. Fish Poop fertilizer feeds plants and microbes and improves soil structure with rich organic matter. It contains available nutrients for quick feed and undigested organic material for slow release with a wealth of beneficial organisms. 5 lucky winners will receive a whole gallon of fish poop along with some fish poop swag. So go to shapingfire.com before July 29th to sign up for the newsletter and be entered into this month's and all future newsletter prize drawings. You are listening to Shaping Fire, and I am your host, Shango Los. Welcome to episode 115. Today, my guest is Dr. Tess Eidem. Tess Eidem's doctoral research focused on developing novel antibiotics against bacterial pathogens, and her scientific career has centered on bringing modern microbiology and RNA biology practices to promote human health. Leveraging her scientific expertise, Dr. Eidem transitioned into the cannabis industry, where she spent 4 years working directly in cannabis production and quality management. This unique experience allowed her to combine her hands-on skills in manufacturing with microbiology and product safety as a preventative controls qualified individual to help cannabis cultivators minimize potential hazards within their facilities and in their products. Having witnessed firsthand the challenges of microbial contamination in the cannabis industry, Dr. Eidem returned to the University of Colorado Boulder, where she currently works as a senior research scientist in the aerobiology and disinfection laboratory with a focus on practical building science. Her research investigates bioaerosol persistence associated with cannabis environments, including airborne molds, allergens, and pathogens. She's driven to connect unbiased scientific research with environmental engineering principles and applying them to the cannabis space to improve worker well-being, plant health, and consumer safety. During the short first set, we will discuss the nature of bioaerosols. In the longer second set, we will discuss the threat matrix of cannabis bioaerosols. We will look at the various sources of fungal, bacterial, and viral bioaerosols and determine their threat levels to cannabis workers. And we will finish the episode considering actions that cannabis folk can use to keep themselves safe and mitigation actions employers and regulators can implement to decrease bioaerosol risk. Welcome to Shaping Fire, Tess.
Good to be here.
So let's get right into it. What's the difference between simply smelling cannabis and enjoying those aromatics like we all do versus inhaling bioaerosols that can be harmful when in volume?
That's a really good question. And the aroma that comes off of the cannabis flower when you're breathing that in, it's a lot of the vapors, so a lot of the gases that come off of the flower itself. So that's your volatile organic compounds, your VOCs. That'll mostly be terpenes and esters and give those kind of classic aroma, gassy, diesel, fruity types of aromas. While when you're breathing in bioaerosols, it's not just the gases that are present, but there's actually small particles floating around in the air that may contain biological materials, at least in part. So that could be coming from microorganisms in the environment. It can be coming from the plant matter itself. It can be from the substrates. It can be from humans. So there's a lot of different things that can be floating around in the cannabis environment that are actually bioaerosols, in addition to those vapors that give aromas.
Right on. So would those vapors that give the aromas, would those also be a subset of bioaerosols? They're just not the bioaerosols that we're concerned about, or are they not actually considered bioaerosols because they don't have airborne particulate matter?
That is a great question too. So the definition of an aerosol is it's got to have that physical mass. It's in a solid form, so it's not in gaseous phase. So those aerosols are the particulate matter, while VOCs are going to be in gas phase. So it's kind of like, for example, a difference would be when it's really humid out, that's water in its vapor phase. That's your relative humidity. But if I were to spray you with a spritzer, that little spritzer is generating tiny little aerosols of water. So like tiny little droplets of water, essentially. So that's the difference between an aerosol and a vapor.
Right on. That makes sense to me. And it makes sense why it would potentially injure the human body a lot more, because the gas will, we more easily gotten rid of by our human system than little chunks of stuff. To use the scientific terms, chunks of stuff.
Chunks of stuff. Yeah. I like it. We're going to COS, the chunks of stuff. We love to make acronyms in science. Yeah, I mean, VOCs can be potentially harmful, especially at high levels, but it has to be pretty high. And different VOCs is like grouping in tons of different organic compounds. So some may be at higher levels, tend to be more irritants, or if it comes in contact with your skin, some people don't. If you get contact with like essential oils, most essential oils are actually terpenes. And sometimes that can irritate people's skin, or it can be soothing to some people. So it really just depends on a person's sensitization to those different compounds and the specific compounds that are part of those VOCs.
Right on. Understood. So during the introduction to this show, I pointed out for folks that you are really on the cutting edge of this science, and that the research here is just starting. And so, of course, I'm going to be asking you to theorize some as the expert to help give us context. But what I want to ask about is, how are these harms theoretical? Because as people who work in the cannabis industry, I mean, I know that when I work with the plants, when a lot of them touch my skin over the course of a day, I'll get, a rash or hives. So I know my human does have a reaction to the plant, sometimes in ways that are less pleasant because those hives are a real drag. But I've got lots of friends who work in the industry, but who don't complain about the kinds of issues that are in the study. Are these harms more theoretical that they could happen, or are we already seeing them in people who work in cannabis?
Yeah, we are seeing it in the limited reports that are out there. People do have that contact dermatitis, or they develop hives from touching plants. That's why you'll usually see people wear like sleeves during harvest to protect their arms from that contact. And that could be the result of a lot of different things. It could be irritants from that plant. It could be developing allergies, which is a little less understood. And then there's the respiratory exposures, which can also be harmful. And, even though there's not a lot of data out there in the cannabis space, we know based on, parallels in other industries, other agricultural settings, that these agricultural dusts and those environments can generate potentially harmful aerosols or bioaerosols that, especially over the course of time and repeated exposures, some people tend to, genetics plays a role in this too. So some folks may be more sensitized to some of these agents in the air for all sorts of reasons. And so one of the reasons why I think it's not as investigated in the cannabis space is because the cannabis industry is really relatively pretty new. Here in my home state of Colorado, it's been recreationally legal since 2014. So we have like 10, maybe 20 years of data of looking at some of these bioaerosols, but most of the recent reports have been within the last couple years, and it has to do with, employees having adverse events at work to something in the air in these facilities.
I'm sure that there is a not insignificant number of people who are not reporting as well. And how can the science capture the incidences if the employee doesn't report it, or if the employer doesn't report it, or if there's nowhere to report it to? So in your research, what are some of the main reasons you have found that underreporting happens?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and it's my answer will be pretty speculative, but from my experience, a lot of these cannabis companies, because cultivating and manufacturing cannabis is still federally illegal, there's kind of this concept that federal oversight on employee health standards and employee safety don't apply to these cannabis companies, which is just untrue. Like OSHA regulations, or the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, their standards and their regulations still apply in these cannabis operations. And then, there's just in general, there's a kind of a stigma surrounding cannabis in general, from reporting it to your doctor that you use it, to reporting incidents at work, especially some of, unlike getting run over by a forklift or something like that, or, some of these maybe repeated motions that are pretty typical of a lot of other manufacturing and cultivation environments, having adverse events like respiratory distress is not as well understood, and not everyone experiences it exactly the same. So because, some people may experience it, other people in that exact same environment may not experience like shortness of breath or wheezing or other respiratory issues. They may feel like it might be in their head, or something's wrong with them, or they just don't want to be associated with cannabis in general, at least officially, and so they may not report it to their internal safety manager if they have one, or to their state OSHA or NIOSH representatives.
So in the second set, we're going to talk more about the specific threats, but generally speaking, are these bioaerosols and the impact on the humans who work there, is this something that really only impacts those working in manufacturing commercial quantities of cannabis, or might these fungal spores and bacteria and plant materials be at a high enough density in a cannabis patient's home greenhouse or in their basement, say of like 20 or let's say 15 to 25 plants, which might be typical of a patient, regardless of what the law says, that, that's fairly typical. Could these bioaerosols exist at that low of a density, or does it really have to be scaled commercial growing?
I think that the scaling, just like anything else, scaling also your problem scale. So I
Amen.
would say that it's probably more likely that these, the diversity and the amount of bioaerosols in some of these indoor commercial operations, especially those that are retrofitted buildings or maybe have improper HVAC design and implementation, you probably are going to see much higher levels of bioaerosols in those environments, just because of the sheer number of plants, and they're all, transpiring and putting in moisture in the air, and the materials in those spaces may not be suitable for the high humidity, warm temperature conditions. And so you probably are seeing it more in those environments, especially in cultivation, and then maybe slightly different bioaerosols on the processing side of things. And, when you're grinding 50 pounds of flour a day, you probably are going to be exposed to a lot more of these bioaerosols than when you're just grinding up, a pound that you harvested, a couple weeks ago, and you're now trimming or grinding at home. So it really does depend, and it depends on your unique home environment as well. Really controlling the temperature and humidity. And then if you do notice that you have respiratory distress when you're handling plant matter, especially dried plant matter, then I would just say at home to wear like a respirator, like an N95. We're all pretty familiar with these things since COVID, but that will help to prevent being exposed to some of those potential particulates.
And for goodness sakes, if you're doing this at home, well, also at work, use a HEPA filter, for goodness sakes.
Yes.
We've got a patient organization here on Vashon Island where I live, and at least until COVID, prior to COVID, we would all get together every fall and trim together. And when you've got that many people with that many plants from different places, people would find themselves sneezing. They're like, I don't sneeze around my own plants, but everybody's growing in different ways. And so just those very basic things like masking and gloves and a HEPA filter, for anybody who, well, not only do you want to use it for people who are sensitive, but it's really good to use that stuff even if you're not sensitive yet, because so many people become sensitive from repeat usage, right? So if somebody's listening to the show and they're feeling cocky, they're like, oh, there's none of this at my work environment. It's like, well, you might not just be sensitive yet, right?
Right. Yes. You can definitely develop allergies just like with anything else in your life. You may not have allergies to gluten when you're young, but as you get older, you might develop them. And that's true for cannabis as well. You can develop allergies against cannabis. There's also potentially different molds that could be on the product or in the environment that could exacerbate that, or you could potentially be allergic to those as well. So it's not very well understood, but there is evidence that that you can become sensitized to specific protein allergens from the cannabis plant itself.
I want to hit on an answer you gave a little earlier about the web of regulation. I can imagine that the web of regulation regarding cannabis bioaerosols is a total mess since cannabis is still legal at the federal level. You've got some of the federal agencies that are not regulating it because it's not legal, but then you've got other federal agencies like OSHA that are still encouraging employee protection at these companies. But then you've got the states who are trying to normalize, like I'm sure that most of them are trying to regulate it at some level, creating this patchwork. Is anything effective about this patchwork? Are we moving in the right direction, or is it just going to be a mess until federal legalization?
Well, I do think that the legal status of cannabis definitely makes it more challenging to provide baseline data and just the basic research to understand what's floating around in these diverse indoor environments, and maybe even mixed environments like greenhouses. The process of cannabis cultivation and dry curing is pretty uniform every grow I go to. I mean, there's slight variance on how each grower does it, but the process is pretty similar. But the environments in which those are grown in are usually very different. I've been to old tuna factories that are now cannabis grows. I've been to state-of-the-art, built in Japan and then shipped over greenhouses. I've been into all these different types of settings for cannabis cultivation, so it's all very diverse, and so that can also change the bioaerosols that are in those environments. And just in general, bioaerosols in indoor environments, from university indoor settings like I'm at right now, to home settings, to other manufacturing settings, There's not that much that's like really understood, and there's definitely not standards that are set by some of these, especially occupational safety standards. So there are definitely standards set for different pollutants, different gases, formaldehyde in the air, ozone in the air. But for aerosols and bioaerosols, it's not, the correlation between exposure and disease is much more challenging to establish. And so a lot of these organizations just don't have standards or regulations on the amount of bioaerosols that can be found in an indoor environment, any indoor environment. And unfortunately, that is compounding the challenges that we have in the cannabis space, is that we just don't have many standards to protect people from high bioaerosol loads in these built environments.
Which all just makes the case for science like you're doing, right?
Yes, more data, always more data.
More data so people can take more action. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, okay, so let's wrap up this first set. During the second set, which will be by far our biggest set today, we're going to talk about the threat matrix of all these various bioaerosols and how they act independently. So make sure to come back after the break. You are listening to Shaping Fire, and my guest today is microbiologist Tess Eidem. And without these advertisers, Shaping Fire would not happen. So please support them and let them know that you heard them on Shaping Fire. You've heard me talk about the award-winning cannabis seeds that come from the analytical breeding program of Seth and Eric Crawford, who founded Oregon CBD Seeds. In fact, Seth was a guest on Shaping Fire in 2020 to talk about triploid genetics. Seth and Eric are now releasing high THC seeds for home growers and farms as Grow the Revolution Seeds at gtrseeds.com. Their high THC seeds are extraordinary in that they will start to flower at 16 and a half hours of daylight instead of the typical 14 and a half hours of daylight. That means in most regions, your plants will start to flower outdoors in the middle of July instead of the middle of August, which means these photoperiod plants finish in September and not October, totally upending the photoperiod seed market. Seth and Eric took their prized early flowering CBG line and bred it to some of the most desired verified genetics out there, including Sour Diesel, Triangle Kush, Wedding Cake, Chemdog, Skittles, and others. These crosses all express powerful photoperiod terpene profiles and THC, giving you a great high. GTR Seeds has a new THCV line with plants like Double Durban and Gigantor that boast 1-to-1 THC to THCV, and people want that THCV. GTR seeds are very consistent, true-growing, inbred F1s from stabilized inbred parent lines. These seeds are nearly homogeneous, and the plants should all grow the same. There is only one phenotype in every pack, available as diploids and triploids. Seth and Eric's company is still family-owned, patient and employee-centric, and partially powered by their 2 acres of solar panels. Everyone can purchase these seeds and the entire catalog of Oregon CBD seeds at gtrseeds.com. Go to gtrseeds.com today and choose something revolutionary for your next indoor or outdoor run. Fish Poop brand fertilizer is an all-natural fish poop concentrate with nothing added. Real fish poop is extraordinarily complex. Not only are you adding the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium your plants need to build mass, transport nutrients, and enhance flavor, but fish waste is also packed with biological activity and micronutrients. When you add fish poop to your irrigation water, you are adding life force, probiotics, and active microbes. These microorganisms include a wealth of various bacteria and protozoa which further enhance nutrient availability for the plants. Because plants are limited by the absence of any essential micronutrient, these trace nutrients are the difference between having a decent garden and having a garden that makes you feel really proud of your efforts. Fish poop is a naturally complete solution that fills in the cracks in your fertilizer program to ensure you offer your garden a broad base of nutrients. Not all fish poop is created equally. Most products with added fish waste don't reveal their sources or lab results. Fish Poop brand Fish Poop, however, generates their own fish waste as a byproduct of their organic aquaponics cannabis farm where they raise ornamental koi and tilapia. You are even invited to tour their farm in person or on their YouTube channel to look for yourself. This sort of transparency is wildly rare in the fertilizer market. The folks behind Fish Poop are also lifelong medical cannabis producers who have deep connections in the community, donate more product than they sell, and support cannabis prisoner, veteran, and patient collectives and charities. To get your bottle of pure fish poop, go to fishpoop.com. And to see their entire line of cannabis products, go to ounceofhope.com. That's Fish Poop, brand Fish Poop. Revenue is tight for cannabis businesses right now. There is no question about it. And when revenue tightens, businesses need to spend smarter on advertising. Instead of throwing obscene money at hanging your company's logo from the rafters at your next convention, perhaps consider placing commercials on Shaping Fire. And if you are a very small business, there is simply no better bang for your buck than commercials on Shaping Fire, especially if your products are for regeneratively minded cultivators. Advertising on this show allows us time to talk about your product, service, or brand in a way that really lets people know what sets your company apart from the others. Bold people who own companies know that getting into relationship with their customers is essential. That is what we offer. We will explain your service or product, what sets it apart as desirable, and help our audience get in contact with you. It's pretty simple, really. Advertising does not have to be all whiz-bang, smoke, and mirrors. Nowadays, I find that people prefer just to be spoken to calmly, accurately, and with good intentions. If you want to make your own commercial spot, you can do that too. With a commercial on Shaping Fire, you'll reach your customers in the privacy of their headphones right now, and will continue to reach new listeners as they explore the Shaping Fire back catalog of episodes again and again for years. A spot on Shaping Fire costs less than a postcard per person, and the Shaping Fire audience is full of smart cannabis enthusiasts, cultivators, and entrepreneurs who are always curious to learn. And right now in the new year, we are booking the few open spots we have for the rest of 2024. I'd love for you to be one of our new advertisers. Do yourself a solid and contact us today for rates on podcast and Instagram advertising. Email hotspot@shapingfire.com to find out more. Welcome back. You are listening to Shaping Fire. I am your host, Shango Los, and my guest today is microbiologist Tess Eidem. So before the break, we talked mostly about the framework, what bioaerosols are, and the real harm that's happening to folks in cannabis, and the fact that there really isn't any good research on this yet. And so this preliminary and like, you know, not preliminary, but this original research that we're talking about today is shining a light on something that needs to be looked at much more closely long term for our friends who work in cannabis. So Tess, you know, during the first set we talked about bioaerosols that are created during cannabis cultivation, and we gave a definition, but what are these bioaerosols that we want to be so aware of?
Yeah, so with COVID, I think more folks are a little bit more educated on this, just with the baseline understanding. And a lot of times when we think of bioaerosols, we think of these intact microorganisms. So we've got intact viruses or intact bacteria or intact like mold spores that are floating around either, from like a moldy part of the environment that you're in and they're releasing those spores, or it could be generated when, let's say, you're watering or there's aerosolization of water that contains some of these microorganisms, or, in disease transmission, we talk about a lot the aerosols that are created when we're talking to each other, breathing normally. And so all of that can generate bioaerosols in an environment. And in the cannabis space, there has been some research that's been done to kind of try to get an understanding of what's actually floating around in the air when it comes to these biological organisms. And from an industrial hygiene perspective, a lot of times what people will do is they'll go into facilities and they'll sample, they'll take a certain volume of air and they'll do a lot of counting. So they'll count the number of mold spores and try to bin them into different groups of molds. Or they'll take that air sample and they'll culture it on petri dishes and be able to get a number of viable microorganisms or colony forming units, CFU, which might sound familiar to those folks who know anything about cannabis testing. CFU is also used to enumerate viable microbes on the cannabis flower itself, but the CFU of microorganisms can be in the air as well. And so you think about those intact microorganisms, those viable microorganisms. And then there's also their breakdown products. So they're metabolites. They can secrete into the environment different metabolites. They can break down over time. And so these micro bits and pieces can end up being in the air, especially if it's part of these agricultural dusts that may settle, but then become more airborne during, normal work environment conditions and activities in that environment. And those microbial metabolites can include different types of toxins. They can include just immune activators. Your immune system over billions of years has really developed a way to identify something that's foreign, especially if it's bacterial or fungal. It's like, that's not me, and I'm going to mount a response at that. And then there's these other different types of protein components that typically are what we call allergens. And those activate a different branch of the immune system. And that's where we get, the stereotypical allergies from, when there's a lot of pollen in the air, or if you're allergic to cats or dogs and you go into somebody's house and they have cats, you're going to be breathing in sort of, the protein allergens from those cats and dogs. And those can also be present, not necessarily cats and dogs, although I have seen a dog in a grow before.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that. Yeah.
Yeah. But, from any molds that are in that environment, they can definitely produce lots of different types of allergens. And the cannabis plant itself can also produce different allergens. So those are kind of it spreads the entire spectrum from these intact organisms, some of which may be harmful and pathogenic, and then all the way down to breakdown products or bits and pieces or metabolites that can also be harmful in different ways.
So I want to shine our light for a moment on the measurement standard CFU, because, when you were originally answering the question, you were talking about intact fungal spores and such. And I was thinking about intact. What does she mean about intact? And I'm like, oh, it probably relates to CFU, which I didn't really mean. I didn't really grok it very well until I read your paper, because I think there was something about the new fear about it. Because when I'm talking with folks about cannabis testing and they talk about CFU, it doesn't really seem like a threat. But when I read your paper and I read about CFU, and for those of you who don't know, it's colony forming units. Now it totally sounds like alien invasion. And I'm all like, wow, like in the cultivation space, there are these fungal spores and different biology that are floating around, and they are alive, and they could form colonies, and I'm breathing them in. And that seems super creepy to me. And I think that it really kind of shines a light on our conversation in a different way, which I think that people could make this conversation kind of like intellectualized and get really into just the data and not realize that really we're talking about like one variety of living biology coming in contact with another variety of living biology being us. And,
right.
and like, how are these two biology is going to interact? Are they, is our immune system just going to squash them, or are they going to like ruin our whole week or longer by forming these colonies, right? That we refer to in the standard. And so I just add that to make these microbiology sized living organisms seem more real, because as soon as you start talking about CFU, it really gives them a lot more of an aggressive personality.
Yeah, because they're alive, because when you look at a comparison, so if I were to take a set volume of air and look at that air that I collected either on a filter, or there's lots of different ways to collect biological particulate from the air that will, preserve it. Sometimes that impaction can kill microbes, so your collection method is really important when you're trying to evaluate certain, especially viable microorganisms in the air. And when you're pulling that out of the air, if I were to look at mold spores, for example, I could count the number of mold spores, but not all those mold spores are actually going to turn into a viable colony forming unit, kind of like how when you're growing plants, not all your seeds germinate. So it's really actually a pretty low amount. It's about 1% of mold spores will actually sporulate into a viable colony forming unit. And so you get a slightly different answer, but those mold spores could still potentially be harmful, even though they're not alive, because of these other microbial metabolites that could be on those spores or associated with them, like allergens. And then even if they are alive, they may not really be harmful to most people if they're not pathogens, meaning they don't really cause disease. They don't have the capability to really infect a human. They may be a pathogen, but maybe they're not very good at being transmitted through the route of inhalation. So some microorganisms are better at, being breathed in and being transferred from one person to another, like many viruses are transferred that way. Legionnaire's disease, that's bacterium that can be transferred in the air and spread disease, usually from water. And then so some microorganisms just aren't really good at being transmitted by disease through the air, but those that are could potentially be harmful, especially to a subset of people who may have a compromised immune system. You do have an immune system, a resident immune system in your lung. I'm not an immunologist, but my co-author, Tara Nordgren, who helped me with the paper, she actually studies lung immunology, especially in response to agricultural dusts. And so these viable pathogens could potentially be harmful to those folks who are immune compromised. And that's where you may see, in particular, Aspergillus fumigatus. It's a World Health Organization critical priority fungal pathogen. It could potentially, if it's in the air, which it's very common in the air in many different environments, if you are a particularly sensitive person or have a compromised immune system, there could be a chance that exposure could result in some type of Aspergillus-related disease, which can come in a variety of different flavors, from aspergillosis, which is that active fungal infection of the lung, to different hypersensitivities to Aspergillus. And again, that has to do with exposure to those allergens.
When we get to that part of the study where it lists all of the Latin names of all of the things that could go wrong with you, it does seem like a threat. I'm like, are you threatening me? It's like these are, none of these things are things that I want to get from my plants. And I think that for most people, when they say, oh, there can be things in the air in the grow, most people are just assuming that these are things that are drifting off of the plant, right? But it was really remarkable to me to read all of the different sources that you identify in the paper. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Like there's at least 8 or 9 of them. We don't have to go through them all, but would you review, a handful of them for us? Because what I'm hoping to get out of this question is people to have a better understanding of all the different places that bioaerosols that could threaten them start.
Yeah, absolutely. So in that paper, there's a figure that just kind of shows the general process of cultivation, dry cure, and the manufacturing processing side. And at each point in the process, there's likely different bioaerosols being generated from different sources. And that can include the substrate that you're working with, like cocoa coir, or even rock wool could potentially generate different bioaerosols. The fertigation, irrigation system, the HVAC system, even moldy walls or, standing water could potentially result in some of these bioaerosols if you're using beneficial microorganisms or any even beneficial like predatory mites or other insects. Insect allergies are pretty common, and people who work, there's actually been documentation of developing allergies towards some of these insects and arachnids that are used in these cultivation facilities. And then along the entire process, when you transition over from cultivation into dry cure and really particularly in manufacturing, much of the bioaerosol that's going to be generated are likely going to be from the plant matter itself. So especially in those handling and trimming and grinding of dried plant material, that's when you start seeing more and more of the bioaerosols being composed of that plant matter.
So, Shaping Fire, we tend to lean towards regenerative growing topics. We're not very into salt growing and A+B here, and in even outdoor and sunshine. So we tend towards that direction here. And what I'm hearing from you is that certainly while some of the chemical contaminants or chemical issues that we might inhale might go away, most of everything you're talking about is biology and sounds like it would be just as applicable to a regeneratively minded grow as it would a full-on chemical hydroponic grow.
Yeah, sure. I mean, these biological components are going to be present in lots of different, ways of growing and cultivating cannabis. And I'm definitely a believer of regenerative farming and agriculture, as well as, I love microbes. I think that they definitely can help in the grow, beneficials. But it's about kind of understanding what is in the air and monitoring that and controlling that, so that you're really minimizing exposure, because it's about exposure and the frequency exposure, the amount that you're exposed, and your genetic predisposition that's going to ultimately result in whether or not you have a negative health outcome because of some of these exposures. And many people who work in agriculture over time, especially in Nebraska, where I'm from originally, and where a lot of this research is being done at my alma mater at University of Nebraska Medical Center, people who work in these agricultural industries tend not to want to wear masks. They don't, that kind of last engineering control that you can put in place, that mask over your face to protect you, is not, the kind of culture there is, oh, I'm not going to wear a mask. And that's fine, except for you're being exposed to some of these dusts, you're being exposed to some of these other elements that could be in the air. And I think that can translate over into cannabis as well, as you may be exposed, but you don't know, what's really in the air. And so I think doing some basic monitoring can be really helpful, so that you can kind of gauge, well, do I really have anything to worry about, or are our levels pretty, relatively low from the few kind of standards that are out there, or is it more in line with like a post-hurricane building that's had flood damage, and I've got mold spore levels like in line with some of these remediated sites. So kind of trying to gauge that for yourself really requires you to take a look at what's floating around.
I know this is kind of a sidebar, but this whole idea of wearing masks while doing agriculture is still relatively new to me.
Right.
But it was really run home for me it's been about a month ago now. I was down in Oxnard doing some bioremediation consulting for soil biologist Leighton Morrison, who's been on the show a couple times. And I was down there. We were working with this fancy new compost recipe. And while I was staying at his house, my asthma just was like terrible. And because I was being a smart aleck, I was blaming the local flower that I picked up at a dispensary in Oxnard. And he's like, man, you're missing the bigger point. We're in the heart of old school petroleum agriculture here. And I'm like, oh, I didn't think about it. And we jumped in the car and we drove around, and he just showed me, thousands and thousands of acres that were all overtilled and nutritionless and microbeless and was all dusty and blowing in the wind. And he's like, this is the air that you're breathing at my house, dude. And I'm like, oh my gosh. Like, I didn't, we're only like 3-4 blocks from these fields, of course. And he described all the weird things that happens in his yard because of all the things that they spray just a couple blocks away. And I started thinking to myself, well, when I visit him, I should probably wear a mask. This really isn't good for my asthma. But then we go for a drive, and I see all of these workers who are there working in the fields right there with all this dust blowing around, and it's filled with traditional petroleum, pesticides and chemicals. And it really drove the idea home of why people in agriculture should be wearing masks. It makes me think of like the other traditional industries where you trade your body for work, like coal mining, right?
Yeah. And that was, in coal mining, and black lung and things like that, that's not necessarily exposure to bioaerosols, but these tiny particles that basically, can physically cause damage to your lung. And that mounts an immune response, which then can restructure your lung physiology, and that can lead to disease. So it's a different pathway, but you get some similar end results. COPD, what's the last one?
Hypersensitive pneumonis.
Yes. So there's a lot of different. Your lungs can be hurt in lots of different ways. It doesn't need to be biological. It can be chemical. It can be physical. But yeah, anytime there's a lot of particulate in the air, it's generally a good idea to wear like an N95 respirator, just to protect yourself from just the sheer amount that you're breathing in. Like, your lungs can, kind of clean that out for the most part. But if they're really, really fine particles, and this is really the important part when it comes to a health perspective, really fine particulate matter that's below about 2.5 microns can go deep down into the lungs and even be directly absorbed into the bloodstream. And so, yes, those can cause different pulmonary diseases over time, but it's also linked to other systemic disease that a lot of times doesn't get as much attention. But for example, there are several publications out showing that exposure, especially to these fine particulate matter species, can lead to neurodegenerative diseases. And that is less well understood. But it's definitely a whole body thing. It's not just your lungs. If they're really small, they can get into your bloodstream, travel to different parts of your body. And if it's repeated exposure over a long period of time, can lead to a diverse set of pathologies.
So the part of the paper that really caught my attention was the different sizes of these particulates, the top being, say, 10 micron, and then going down to the 2.5 micron that you mentioned. The smaller they get, the more dangerous they are. And so many of us are kind of like, you got to cut, just throw some mud on it and let's go, kind of like let's not necessarily respect the damage that has been done to us. It becomes way more sneaky when we're talking about inhaling things that are sub 10 micron, because we don't know what's happening. And it's very likely that since we don't know that it's happening at work, we may blame it on our house or our bed sheets or our spouse's fragrance or all of these things, when it's actually happening at work. It's kind of like an invisible threat.
Yeah. So the size of these particles is really, it's impactful from a health perspective, but also from just an aerosol science perspective. So the smaller the particles are, the longer they can stay floating around in the air as well. So not only could you breathe them in and they go deeper into your lungs, but they're likely going to be more sustained exposure hazards, because they're going to be floating around in the air for longer periods of time before gravity pulls them down and they deposit onto the ground or onto the walls or whatever these particles end up. It's called deposition in aerosol science. So they end up falling, essentially. And the bigger particles, usually, over 10 microns, they will go up in the air and fall right back down. But smaller, around 10 microns and smaller, they tend to stay in the air for minutes or even hours, depending on how small they are. So not only from a health perspective, but also from a building science perspective, the size of the particulates, including their composition, are really important when you're trying to understand the impacts that these different particles can have on workers or on other folks in indoor environments in general. And what's interesting is that, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, OSHA, and indoor air quality standards are all they look at these particles slightly different. And so even though we're all trying to look at these particles and assess how they could be harmful, there's different binning of sizes and which categories may be most harmful, depending on if you're looking at an environmental health perspective, an occupational health perspective, or just an indoor air quality perspective. It's really interesting to have these three kind of different but overlapping fields trying to assess these bioaerosols.
It's really troubling as a regenerative farmer who loves microbes to look at the microbes as any kind of an enemy, right? I mean, like we wear t-shirts, I love microbes and microbe farmer and all this, right? We love the microbes, and we're usually spending our time like incubating them to create more of them to pour into the substrate to feed the soil so the soil can feed the plant. And yet your paper talks about these pathogenic microbes, and they are a human threat in our environments. It's obvious, that it's true, but it's also troubling that this type of biology that we are in such support of also can be threat if they are of a pathogenic variety to a human.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I'm a big fan of microbes myself. I'm a microbiologist. I love fermented foods. I definitely think that microbes, they created the planet that we're on today. And I appreciate that and love them for that. But they can also, a very small subset of them can directly cause disease. And some microbes don't necessarily have to be pathogens to be harmful. Like I said, some of their basic components, their metabolites, can actually trigger certain immune responses, even though those microorganisms wouldn't necessarily infect you. Just the amount and the types of metabolites that they present could potentially be harmful.
So, Tess, your research also focuses in on microbial metabolites like endotoxin that just pound our immune system. And the study research suggests that this is very common when we are grinding flour, especially for pre-rolls. And anybody who's ever been in that environment knows that, when the material is getting ground, it kind of just like permeates the whole room, and if the doors are open, it can go outside. Because unfortunately, as much as they're supposed to have good HVAC in these places, many of them don't, especially in states that are just becoming cannabis normalizing. So tell us a little bit about this endotoxin that is carried by the flour that gets ground down into pre-rolls.
So endotoxins actually found on gram-negative bacteria. So if you remember your basic micro 101, there's two different basically groups of bacteria, and they're sort of organized by their cell walls and their cell membrane and how that's organized. And gram-negative bacteria have something called endotoxin, or LPS, lipopolysaccharide. And so flour that would have high levels of bacteria on them could potentially have a lot of endotoxin as well. And there's really no peer-reviewed research studying that. I mean, we know that gram-negative bacteria can definitely be on cannabis flower, so it's likely that LPS or endotoxin is on cannabis flower. And there are some white papers out there that have shown and identified endotoxin on cannabis flower that's commercial within the state. Medicinal Genomics, I think, put out that white paper last year showing that you can identify endotoxin on cannabis flower that is commercially available to people. And even in that report that came out about that fatal occupational asthma attack in Massachusetts of a cannabis worker, the OSHA investigators went in and they did some air sampling, and they did find levels were elevated during grinding operations in that room. Now, that company had implemented HEPA filtration after the worker suffered that fatal occupational asthma attack. And so it's not clear what the levels would have been that she would have been exposed to. But that could potentially, and it doesn't have, there's really no established OSHA standards for the amount of endotoxin that, someone can be exposed to, quote unquote, safely over an 8-hour weighted period. There's no OSHA standard for that. We have to go off of other countries' sort of limits to kind of gauge what is a potentially harmful level, but that level is not going to be the same for every individual. So it potentially harmful events could happen at very low endotoxin levels for folks who may be particularly sensitive to that. And so in the handful of studies that look at endotoxin in different cannabis and hemp environments, the levels in cannabis environments, and granted, this is like, maybe 3 to 5 papers that have come out on this. So it's very small in scope. They're not super high in cannabis operations, but they were very high in hemp operations. And that could be just the difference between growing indoor versus outdoor. It could be how these operations are running. It could have just been the luck of the draw, roll the dice and some will be high and some will be low. Again, the sample size is very low. So that is definitely it warrants a lot more investigation on what kind of endotoxin levels are actually in the air especially during processing of these dry flowered products.
I want to end this set talking about bioaerosol synergies, because you make this interesting point during the paper of that there are these various fungal bacteria and viral bioaerosols, and they all kind of impact humans in different ways. But when they get together and party in your immune system, it can cause something entirely different. So will you speak briefly to these synergies and how when these different aerosols work together, they can be made all the worse?
Yeah, so anyone who studies biology knows it's usually not like A plus or A to B to C. It's very complex. There's usually these very interesting relationships and feed forward and feedback pathways and interactions between different biological processes that can create end results that you don't expect based on what went into it. And so, for example, some of these bioaerosols can definitely synergize with each other. Endotoxin can synergize with other toxins and exacerbate different negative health outcomes in mice. You can see enhanced sensitization. So that's that kind of classic IgE mediated, which is that allergen. That's that branch of the immune system that really focuses on those protein allergens. If you're allergic to other plants that have similar proteins to cannabis, that can actually sensitize you, and you can have a greater likelihood of becoming allergic to cannabis. So a lot of the growers that I talk to who are sensitized, because I do know several who are, will say that when there's a lot of pollen outside, they actually notice that their allergies inside the grow are worse. And it's not clear why that is or what's going on there, but it's likely that there's some cross-sensitization that's going on there. And so these bioaerosols have complex relationships, and that's why it's so important to not only just be like, okay, these are the number of particles in the air and the sizes that they are, but taking a deeper dive into what organisms are there, what metabolites are there, what allergens are there, what toxins are there, and really understanding how the diverse kind of, I would say, bioaerosol because we love to add ohm to everything in science, could be leading to some of these potential effects. Now, drawing that causal relationship between exposure to a particular group of different bioaerosols and disease is very challenging, again, because there could be a lot of different things in the air. The amount that's there and the amount that you're exposed, plus your own genetic predisposition, is going to play a big role in that. But it's known that these aerosols and just the different components of these bioaerosols can interact with each other and really exacerbate negative health outcomes.
That's really great, Tess. Well, this isn't really great. That's really awful, but your explanation is really great. So let's go ahead and take a short break and be right back with the third set. You are listening to Shaping Fire, and my guest today is microbiologist Tess Eidem. This message is for folks who grow cannabis. I'm talking to home growers, patients, and commercial growers too. I'm probably talking to you. When you plan out your next growing cycle, be sure to check out Humboldt CSI seeds at humboldtcsi.com. Caleb Inspecta and his family have lived in Humboldt County for over 100 years. For the last 40 years, 3 generations of his family have cultivated extraordinary Sensimilla cannabis in Humboldt, Mendocino, and Trinity counties. Because of his lineage and the hard-earned experience that comes from growing up, smoking, and sifting large populations of cannabis plants in Northern California, the seeds you'll cop from CSI will be winning genetics based on longtime heavy hitters and updated and resifted to bring out new and exotic traits and better yields. Go ahead and ask around. Caleb, also known as Inspecta and Pirates of the Emerald Triangle, is a breeder's breeder. He reaches way back and works with significant strains, recreating them in new and interesting ways that you'll love as a toker and a grower, as well as offering you some surprises that will delight serious seed traders and cultivators. Humboldt CSI goes a further step and selfs all these chemovars so you know all the seeds will be female. These are not experimental feminized seeds. Humboldt CSI releases some of the best female seeds available anywhere, and it will show in your garden. Folks grew quite a bit of CSI Humboldt genetics last year here on Vashon Island, and everyone was pleased. The patients had beautiful female plants and didn't have to cull half of their garden as males. The folks growing for the fun of getting high grew colorful flowers with exceptional bag appeal and great highs. And breeders had 7 out of 7 females in a pack, which gave them a lot of phenotypic choices. Take a moment right now and visit humboldtcsi.com. You'll find an up-to-date menu of both feminized and regular lines, along with photos and descriptions. That's humboldtcsi.com. After you've caught up on the latest Shaping Fire episodes, do you sometimes wish there was more cannabis education available to learn? Well, we got you. Shaping Fire has a fabulous YouTube channel with content not found on the podcast. When I attend conventions to speak or moderate panels, I always record them and bring the content home for you to watch. The Shango Los YouTube channel has world-class speakers including Zoe Sigmund's lecture, Understanding Your Endocannabinoid System, Kevin Jodrey of Wonderland Nursery talking about breeding cannabis for the best terpene profile, Frenchie Cannoli's Lost Art of the Hashishin presentation, Nicholas Mahmood on regenerative and polyculture cannabis growing, Dr. Sunil Agarwal on the history of cannabis medicine around the world, Eric Vlosky and Josh Rutherford on solventless extraction, and Jeff Lowenfels on the soil food web. There are several presentations from Dr. Ethan Russo on terpenes and the endocannabinoid system too. While there, be sure to check out the 3 10-part Shaping Fire Sessions series, one with Kevin Jodrey, one with Dr. Ethan Russo, and one with Jeff Lowenfels. And even my own presentations on how to approach finding your dream job in cannabis and why we choose cannabis business even though the risks are so high. As of today, there's over 200 videos that you can check out for free. So go to youtube.com/Shango Los or click on the link in the newsletter. Sometimes the topics I want to share with you are far too brief for an entire Shaping Fire episode. In those instances, I post them to Instagram. I invite you to follow my 2 Instagram profiles and participate online. The Shaping Fire Instagram has follow-up posts to Shaping Fire episodes, growing and processing best practices, product trials, and, of course, gorgeous flower photos. The Shango Los Instagram follows my travels on cannabis garden tours, my successes and failures in my own garden, insights and best practices from personal grows everywhere, and always gorgeous flower photos. On both profiles, the emphasis is on sharing what I've learned in a way that you can replicate it in your own garden, your own hash lab, or for your own cannabinopathic health. So I encourage you to follow at Shaping Fire and at Shango Los and join our online community on Instagram. Welcome back. You are listening to Shaping Fire, and I am your host, Shango Los. And my guest today is microbiologist Tess Eidem. So, Tess, some of these bioaerosols end up in concentrate products, which are then inhaled. Is it primarily inhaled products like dab oil that are at risk of passing on some of these toxins, or do we find an ingestion risk in ethanol extract oils like RSO or crude or something like that that's going to be eaten?
That is a great question. With the way, so these bioaerosols are generated in these cannabis environments, but the organisms can also be on the plant matter. Like you said, it can also settle from the environment onto the plant matter. And that could carry over onto the product. And that's really interesting that you bring up concentrates, because some of these, like endotoxins, some of these microbial metabolites are pretty fat soluble. So in theory, they would carry over with a pretty hydrophobic molecule like, THC and THCA and CBD and CBDA during these different types of extraction processes, especially if you're using organic solvents. Now, will they end up being intact and able to cause harm in an individual? That is not clear. And really, there's no, for some of these things, there's really no testing that's done. So like endotoxin, which is again part of those bacterial cell membranes, or there's other types of cell membranes from fungi that contain beta glucans, which can also cause harm when breathed in. It's another component of bioaerosols. If you have a lot of fungal contamination, will those carry over onto your extracts? And those are not really being studied. So for compliance testing, it's not required to look at that. And so there's really no R&D being performed in this area. So we don't really know. Now, mycotoxins could potentially carry over and concentrate, but we only really test for a handful of mycotoxins, mostly that are produced by Aspergillus and Penicillium species, but we don't test for other types of toxins that are produced by plant pathogens like Fusarium, which could potentially include some pretty severe toxins. And we don't test for that, so we just don't know. It's a big black box. And so it could potentially carry over. And that's something that we're really interested in from both a concentrate and on the flower, during combustion or during drier vaporization of flower. Are these biological components destroyed? You're heating up to like 400 degrees Celsius, or you're vaporizing at like 180 C or 150 C. Are you going to destroy those biological components, or is it going to just aerosolize them and generate new bioaerosols that now contain these potentially bioactive agents? We don't know. No one has really done any research on that in cannabis, but there is research that has been done on tobacco that has shown that endotoxin can carry over into tobacco smoke. And some scientists do hypothesize that endotoxin that is now in bioaerosols generated during combustion that it contributes to some of these lung diseases that we see in cannabis smokers, especially those that are more inflammatory based, like COPD. So it's not clear in cannabis. There was one paper that was published in the 80s that showed that Aspergillus spores could carry over in cannabis joint into the smoke. So clearly it doesn't, and they were viable at the very end, so they could form a colony forming unit. So it's clear that these biological components can transfer over from flower into smoke, but we just don't know the extent of that. How much of it carries over? Is it 0.0001% of what's on the flower carries over, or is it a much bigger chunk than that? We just don't know. And there's really no research being done on that as far as I know. And as a academic researcher at a federally funded institution, unfortunately, even if cannabis is rescheduled to a Schedule 3 drug, even if I had a DEA Schedule 1 or Schedule 3 license, I still can't go out and pick up commercial cannabis from my state. So I couldn't walk down the street to one of the many dispensaries in Boulder, grab flower and bring it back to my federally funded lab because that is illegal. Even if I have a DEA schedule license, I can only source cannabis from a DEA registered NIDA producer. So,
which is not representative of the stuff that's actually being sold at retail.
Exactly. And that's a big challenge. For academic researchers who want to ask these questions, it's really hard. We can only study, University of Mississippi flower, and I think there's maybe 6 or 7 other approved vendors across the United States. And from a consumer safety perspective, that is very frustrating because I want to know what's on that flower and I want to know what carries over into smoke. And then on the concentrate side, we really don't know. There's some work that's done on like the heavy metals that can be generated. And when pesticides are combusted, what does that result in? There's some work on that, especially in tobacco. But on concentrates, there's really not that much that's understood about the diverse different types of microbial metabolites that could be in there outside of, the 5 or so mycotoxins that are tested for as part of regulatory measures. But there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different mycotoxins. There's endotoxin. There's all sorts of other bits and pieces that we're not really looking at. And so I think that that's an area of research that really needs funding, and there has to be some leeway there for researchers to be able to actually study product that's out on the market that people are using.
Yeah, for as popular as dabbing is, it is amazing that this research hasn't been done yet. There's so many people that could potentially be at very serious risk, and we just don't know yet. So Tess, I want to end with these 2 questions. The first of the 2 is, we've talked a lot about the threat that cannabis workers are under at work. What advice do you have for cannabis workers who do work in an indoor cannabis environment on what they should do best to protect themselves? Because they love working in cannabis, and they feel that working in cannabis is a meaningful role to play, but we don't want them to be putting themselves at risk to be a participant in this. So what actions should they take?
Yeah, so I think that, if a cannabis worker is noticing that they are having, shortness of breath while they're working, or, and I know probably a dozen folks who've had these types of respiratory issues when working with plant, that they should definitely talk to. If they have a safety officer internally, they should talk to them. They should talk to their supervisor, and they should also go to the doctor and be referred to an allergist and see if they have allergies to cannabis or molds. Sometimes it's very challenging to get these cannabis extracts to do like skin prick tests on folks, and in different states it can be very challenging to be able to determine if you do have allergies towards cannabis because of the federally illegal status even of these cannabis extracts that are used for skin prick tests. And so I would recommend, really making sure that you are bringing your concerns to your supervisors, to your safety officers. Make sure that you are wearing an N95 if you do notice you have that respiratory distress, and really try to figure out what it is that could be leading to this. At least go to an allergist and do some basic skin prick tests to see if you do have any sensitization to anything that could be in that environment. And because, there was one study that NIOSH conducted on these 10 workers in the state of Washington, and they followed them. They had different occupational asthma related issues. And I think it was over the course of a year or so. And this NIOSH study followed these workers, and ultimately, unfortunately, all 10 workers ended up having to quit their jobs because they couldn't do the work anymore. So maybe you could ask to be reassigned to a different job duty, especially if it's getting worse and worse, if you want to stay in the cannabis space. But once you develop a sensitization, or, you have these exposures, sometimes if you develop that, it stays with you the rest of your life. So
it really sounds like people should be wearing the N95s even if they're not having a trouble yet. Since you're saying that it's acquired, if somebody loves working in cannabis, it sounds like they should start wearing a mask even when they don't have a problem, so they don't develop a problem.
I mean, it definitely couldn't hurt. I'm a big fan of masking. It definitely couldn't hurt. Another thing they could do is start advocating for basic indoor air quality monitoring. There are very low cost monitors they won't tell you what's in the air, but they'll tell you how many particles of different sizes are in the air. They can monitor like VOCs. And they also monitor temperature and humidity. So you could network those and get kind of like an Internet of Things going and real-time monitoring up and running to evaluate the air quality in there. But it's also good for other important parameters like temperature and humidity, which you also want to be dialed in for your grow anyway. So that's another way that, a company can start looking at their air quality and, putting in additional filtration, making sure that they're really getting, what's recommended as far as air exchange rates per hour, and making sure that they're taking some of these engineering controls too. A mask is great, but it's really that last kind of line of defense. There's other things that you can do in the hierarchy of controls to protect workers in these spaces. So good air filtration, making sure you're getting your air exchange rates up there, and monitoring those environments can be really helpful so that you're avoiding these high levels, so that you don't necessarily have to wear a mask because now you're controlling those at the source.
Excellent. I love that. Short-term solutions for cannabis workers and longer-term solutions for managers of cannabis facilities who want to keep their employees safe while not necessarily overspending. I love it. And that's great.
Yeah.
So Tess, thank you so much for joining us today here on Shaping Fire. This is while this is an easy topic for you as a scientist, I think that those of us who have been in love with cannabis for years and are so used to defending cannabis from all the haters that we never want to say that there's anything bad or potentially dangerous about cannabis. And after doing this for as long as I have to say, unfortunately, when, cannabis can be a threat and we have to stay aware of it, even though it may also be a sacred plant to us. I understand that this is a pretty, this is an opinion here, but it also is not lost on me that the harms from cannabis come from indoor growing, where regenerative is so often outdoor growing, and B, this is all worse at scale when we all tend to love craft. And so I'm not saying that large scale indoor can't be grown in a safe way. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that, gosh, it does seem to be a bit more evidence for outdoor regenerative growing. So Tess, thank you so much for sharing your experience and your insight. And also thank you for being willing to give us a little bit of theorizing mixed in with your hard data so that, here at the beginning of this kind of research, we can understand what the data might be meaning better than just the raw data itself. You've been a wonderful guest. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.
Fabulous. So if you would like to be in contact with Tess, or if you just want to follow along with her work as it evolves, the best place to do that is through her LinkedIn at Tess Eidem, that's EIDEM, or you can go and follow the page for her lab at CU Boulder. So that's the CU Boulder Aerobiology and Disinfection Lab. You can find more episodes of the Shaping Fire podcast and subscribe to the show at shapingfire.com and wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed the show, we'd really appreciate it if you would leave a positive review of the podcast wherever you download. Your review will help others find the show so they can enjoy it too. On the Shaping Fire website, you can also subscribe to the newsletter for insights into the latest cannabis news, exclusive videos, and giveaways. On the Shaping Fire website, you will also find transcripts of today's podcast as well. Be sure to follow on Instagram for all original content not found on the podcast. That's at Shaping Fire and at Shango Los on Instagram. Be sure to check out the Shaping Fire YouTube channel for exclusive interviews, farm tours, and cannabis lectures. Does your company want to reach our national audience of cannabis enthusiasts? Email hotspot@shapingfire.com to find out how. Thanks for listening to Shaping Fire. I've been your host, Shango Los.